Welcome back to the DrupalEasy podcast. This is season 17, episode number 3. In today's episode, we'll be talking with Ryan Price about a project he worked on to update a Drupal 7 site with extensive backend integration to Drupal 10, including some of the challenges they faced and the solutions they used. Before we get to the interview, allow me to remind you that upgrading Drupal 7 sites is one of the core businesses here at DrupalEasy, mostly thanks to our extensive experience with data migration. Contact us for more information. Welcome back to the DrupalEasy podcast, Mr. Ryan Price. How are you?
Doing super well. It is summertime in Oregon and things are happening. The fish are jumping. The cotton is high. None of those things are true.
Let me ask a question.
Yes.
I just gave a presentation today where I had to give people my background in Drupal. And a couple years ago, I stopped counting like how long I've been in Drupal. And I just changed it to, I've been in Drupal since 2006. How do you answer that question? How long have you been hanging around the Drupal community?
That's a good question. I guess I just say usually that I've used more versions of Drupal than most people own cars. Something like that.
Well, that's not too difficult these days with the rapid pace of major updates. So.
But even before, right? I still have had, more Drupals than cars, even if you only got to 8.
Oh, so actually you're talking about ever, like cars ever owned, not currently owned, but how many cars you've ever owned.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So you and I have been around for roughly the same amount of time.
Very, very similar time spans. Yeah.
So what are you doing these days? Who are you working for?
I work at a consultancy called ICF. It is a really big company that you may not have heard of unless you work in government. I don't think it's exclusively government, but there's a lot of that in there. And I'm working on a government contract. So it's the Health and Human Services is a department of the U.S. government, and then there's sort of like a bunch of sub-departments under there. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be eventually in charge of a whole bunch of Health and Human Services sites, as long as they keep our contract up. It's government stuff is its own special beast that I am learning a lot about. I've done some things with like municipal governments, or I did one with a state government in the past, but even at the federal level, it gets more layers of complexity.
So if you were meeting another Drupal developer for the first time and they asked, what do you do with Drupal, or what's your Drupal background? And, you're at a party, so, it's going to be a quick conversation type of thing. Like, well, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I started doing Drupal in very early days. Drupal 4.6 was the first Drupal I ever used. And I started helping out at a meetup and some Drupal camps locally in Florida where I was living. I started working on this podcast and some training exercises. I've done session selections with the Drupal Association for the Drupal cons. I've done mentoring programs with Drupal Association. I actually helped start something that was like a precursor to that. And I've done a whole bunch of websites, including things like Pfizer or the Olympics for NBC, colleges and nonprofits, and now federal government websites.
So, and you're kind of a jack of all trades, right?
I do a lot of everything. At my current job, I actually do a lot more Linux system administration than anybody has ever asked me to do professionally. It's something that I always kind of did on the side because I was doing like self-hosting of my own site and things like that. And I never really wanted to pay someone, a big pile of money just to give me the really basic thing that I could do on my own. So I've never had my personal site on like a, platform as a service type of a host, but plenty of client sites I do. But where we are now, we actually have a lot more of that. Like we're given a virtual host and we have to set it up ourselves for reasons.
And you are currently involved in helping to organize an event that's coming up in the Drupal community, correct?
Yeah. So in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of the cities are pretty closely located. For the West Coast, close. It takes me like 3 hours to get to Seattle and maybe 6 or 7 hours to get to Vancouver. So between those three cities, we have a rotating camp schedule. Every other year, it moves to a new city. So this year is going to be Seattle. It's the first time that we've done Drupal Camp since before the pandemic, and it's called the Pacific Northwest Drupal Summit. It's going to be in Seattle, October 11th through the 13th, and we're going to have a lot of sessions, day and a half of sessions. We're going to have a contribution room. We're going to have training by somebody that you might know. Mike is going to come and do his professional, what do you call it?
Professional development tools.
There you go. Professional development tools workshop on Friday. And there'll be a social time and getting to hang out in downtown Seattle and particularly around the University of Washington campus. It's a really cool space, and we're going to have the whole building to ourselves, more or less, for the days of the camp. So it should be a really great time, and it's not expensive, and you should come check us out. And we will put a link in the show notes.
Super duper. All right. So we are going to talk about a couple of projects, or maybe it's one project. I'm going to let you explain that in a minute, that you've been working on lately. And the super short version is these were Drupal 7 sites with a lot of backend integration that have moved to Drupal 10 sites where that backend integration has been completely redone using modern methods. So we're going to kind of talk about that process a little bit. So why don't you tell us about the project a little bit?
Sure. So I will say this is a project I did for a former employer, and I'm going to decide not to mention their name if I can help it during this episode, but it's not like it's a secret. I worked on this site for over a year, and between the two sort of like projects that were sistered together, as it were, these two organizations, they have study abroad programs. So what you do is, I'm a college student and I would like to go travel to Spain or to Germany or to Japan. And if you're in the United States, you deal with IES. If you're in the Asia Pacific area, you would deal with a company that's called the Study Abroad Foundation, or SAF. IES, I think, used to have an acronym that it meant something, and now it's just like a lot of modern company names. It just IES stands for IES. So it's iesabroad.org if you want to look it up. They have a couple of thousand students that they send abroad every year, just from the US to various other parts of the world. And they actually have a dedicated building at a lot of their partner schools. So you will stay in the same dorm room as all of the previous study abroad students, and your classes are actually taught in a space that's more or less dedicated to the study abroad program. So they have an interesting setup where you're not just like signing up to go to another school. You're going to have this whole like kind of catered experience. So along with that, there's the admissions process. And if you've ever applied to a college before, or, applied to a government job, you know that there's a lot of paperwork that goes along with it. You have to prove, who you are, give a lot of information about yourself traveling abroad. They're also trying to help this experience be as easy as it possibly can be for all the students, the parents, the schools who have to, grant credit to these students afterwards, everybody involved. There's lots of people and lots of moving parts. So it's not an uncomplicated thing like, hey, I want to buy tickets to go to a concert, which is still plenty complicated, but imagine having to buy tickets to a concert that lasts for 3 months or 6 months. So there's a lot more details that you need to collect.
So what was your starting point?
Yeah, they had a Drupal 7 site that was built, in the pretty early Drupal 7 era, and lots of custom code. There were some files that had thousands of lines and dozens of functions in them. Not any like really terrible things like you would see like SQL queries in the templates or anything like that. It was pretty well done for what it was, and given that it was organically grown over time, as you will with any project that lasts for 7 or 10 or more years, you have, you'd always have to make that trade-off between, we need to finish this new feature now versus we need to go refactor everything so that it's easy to maintain later.
In talking to you about this before we recorded, you mentioned that the process is actually managed both on the Drupal site and also in a backend application. And both those things need to talk to the same data and pass data around.
Exactly.
So is it safe to assume that that's still the case with the Drupal 10 site?
Yeah. So this is kind of the biggest challenge with this project. There are a lot of things, but we're going to kind of focus on just this backend integration. When, for example, a student, wants to sign up to apply to the program, they need to get a record in this backend database. When somebody inside of the IES organization wants to review that information, they want to review that information, but they need to be able to see more things. So they have their own in-house homegrown things, but only IES employees can use that and see that, and it sort of like exists inside the firewall. But then the person from the school, who is like your college advisor, sometimes there's a person dedicated to study abroad, sometimes it's somebody in the admissions office, it kind of depends, can go into that interface and approve students who want to go on these programs. But in order to do that, they don't have access to the IES firewall. So we need to give them a web application. In this case, it was a React application so that they could view that stuff. It didn't used to be a React application. It used to be Drupal 7. So there's a lot of moving parts. A lot of people need to touch all the same records over the course of, could be 3 to 4 weeks. It could be 3 to 4 months. It kind of depends on timing and everything like that. And then once you kind of get accepted and you're in the program, the Drupal site doesn't really matter anymore. This really is a conversion website to get you from being, I don't know what IES is. I know what IES is. Now I need to decide where I want to go. Once you decide where you want to go, I need to apply. And then there's a whole several step process of application. And tracking that was really kind of the big meat of this project.
So the way I think that this would be approached is one of the early decisions has to be, where's the canonical source of data? Is the Drupal database the canonical source of data? Is this backend system the canonical source of data? Are we constantly syncing data between the two? Or is it only synced when certain actions happen on one side or the other? So I guess my question is, as far as all those decisions, did you just match what was happening in Drupal 7? Or was there kind of all right, let's step back. Let's look at the things that really worked in Drupal 7 and, versus the things that didn't work, and refactor and fix some maybe long-standing issues in Drupal 10. So what was that thought process like?
Exactly that. So in Drupal 7, a lot of the records were created first in Drupal 7, synced to the other database. But because of the way the code was written, it needed to be perfectly in sync, and we needed to have a copy on both places. And myself and John Kerba, who was another tech lead that was involved with this project, we both looked at that and we said, we want to do better. We also decided to rethink the information architecture, the sort of like content types and things they would use to represent all the data on the Drupal site, to store as little as possible on the Drupal site as we could. There are certain things that just because of when they get collected, so the first time that you fill out your application, all of your like personally identifiable information, all the sort of information from your application needs to be stored on the Drupal site, just so that we can access it very quickly. And there's, like really short round trips, right? Once you say submit the application, that now becomes locked. It's read only, essentially. And then we now start treating the backend database as the source of truth. And from then on, go ahead.
When you say submit the application, so what I'm envisioning is that the person actually filling out the application, that might be done in more than one sitting.
Exactly.
They might sit down, start the application, get a third of the way through and say, oh, I need to go get this document and this document. So let me save the application where it is, come back a day later, add more info. And it's only when that document, that application is complete, do they hit the button. And as you said, it actually submits it, it locks it, and then the next step of the process.
Right. And if you think about the time before the Drupal 7 site, this was a paper application. And so submit was put a stamp on it and put it in the mail, right? So that submit step is similar to put a stamp on it and put it in the mail. And then from then on, I guess they would have to call you or send you back a letter, in order to make changes or updates. But you can kind of think of that process of like sending something in the mailbox is the same thing for us as sending it to the backend database.
So were you using a content type or a custom entity or a web form or something else as the actual Drupal, I'll use the word entity here, to collect that data for the application?
We ended up deciding on web form, and I think the number one reason why I picked that was because I knew that sometimes the questions have to get changed. So maybe like they want to rephrase the wording of something, or one of the things that we added as we upgraded to the new site was they added a whole bunch of more fields around your gender representation and your pronouns. That was a new field that they were adding to their application that they didn't have in the Drupal 7 days. So we knew that they were going to be adding new questions. We knew they were going to be updating the language on things. So we said, well, web form is a lot easier to maintain than a completely custom thing. Or we were thinking about doing something with JavaScript at some point, but other reasons, the timing just didn't really work out on making that happen. And we looked at doing something like a content type, and we ended up going with web form. And I think doing it again, I probably would have done something a little bit more standalone that didn't care about Drupal as much. Another big advantage of doing it with web form is you could technically start filling it out anonymously, and web form has a really great mechanism for transferring something from anonymous to not anonymous. But partway through the project, we decided, you know what? You're just always going to have to be signed in. So that anonymous bit of the form was actually a custom form anyway. So at the end of the day, I think I would have done it a little bit differently, but it was already mostly finished by the time we got to that level.
So from the student perspective, they go through this process, they submit the application, they hit submit, they're not able to access their application anymore. Maybe it's only in read-only mode. It goes to the back end. So is the student still using the website for updates on their application, or what does that look like? And it sounds like that something's happening on the back end, but then data gets sent back to Drupal in some form. So maybe talk about that a little bit.
This is something we spend a lot of our time and effort on, because the business reason, like why are we building this website, is number one, make the application process as simple and easy to do as possible. Do as much as we can to make that application easy to use. There's lots of work done on the language and the colors and the interface and making it, nice and modern. And then once you submit your application, now you are in this state where you say, I have started my application, and there's a dashboard. Technically, you could get to the dashboard before, but the dashboard for somebody who has not finished their application and somebody who's just finished their application were about the same. With the exception of there's a special widget on the page that says, your application is not finished yet. Please hit this button to finish the application, right? So we had a custom content type with a lot of very highly contextual blocks on them. And that piece of content actually had 7 different states, which were basically represented by 7 different nodes. And one node could say, hey, this is the I haven't finished my application stage. This is the I have finished my application stage. This is the IES has approved my application. This is the my school has approved my application. This is the I need to fill out some more documents stage. This is the I'm about to go on my trip stage. And this is my trip is over stage, right? And because each one of those had a different layout, they wanted to feature different information, like move it up higher in the stack or lower in the stack. They wanted to show off blog posts from other students who have also gone to England, where you're going to be going. At the beginning, if you don't know where you're going, we don't have the ability to feature some of those, program specific things, or the phone number of the person that you can call at your center once you get to your location to get more information. Things like that were not available. There's also a really big packet of all the information you didn't know about going on your trip, like, how do I get a phone card once I get there? Where's the location of the US embassy in that country? All this information that you can download. They don't give you that packet until you're basically done with the process, because there's a lot of program specific stuff in there that actually changes from like even which quote unquote, which major are you taking, right? Are you doing the cultural studies? Are you doing the language study? Are you doing the music program or whatever thing it was? They would all get a slightly different version of that packet. So lots of highly contextual things that show up on these dashboards. Some of it's driven by your user profile and saying, I'm going on the spring 2025 trip to England, and my program is the, government program, whatever thing that you're there to sort of like co-study while you're on your trip. We store all that stuff in your user profile so that we know when we want to present one of those contextual blocks, what do we show you?
So you're not using the workflow? Is that the module that shows you different workflow states?
Yep.
It sounds like you're not using that, correct?
We weren't using that. It was something very, very similar to that.
Yeah.
And even to where there are certain states, if you're trying to go from state A to state B, workflow has some logic built in so that you can only kind of go from one to the other. But one of the reasons being there's no button on Drupal that anyone can push that will make that state change. The only thing that can make that state change is the backend data changing, right? So a lot of those activities are dependent on outside factors. And I feel like a big advantage of using something like workflow is it's got the UI bits of it built in,
right?
In addition to the data structure. So even if, again, like that definitely could have been a choice there, because once you look at the gymnastics that you have to go through to put someone through all those different states, there's a lot in common with the workflow states. Yeah.
So how did you send data from the back end? When an event happened on the back end that had to change something on the Drupal side, was that just you create an endpoint and hit an endpoint, or how did that work?
Yeah. So when Drupal wants to send something to the back end, we put together a big PHP object. We serialize it into JSON and we send it to the right place.
Mm-hmm.
We have to have our API keys set up correctly and things like that.
And how about the other direction?
And yeah, for that, it was pretty similar stuff, like, make a curl request, get access to the JSON, unserialize it, and deal with it as we needed to.
So other than web form, were there any Drupal contrib modules that were like vital to this integration?
Yeah, because the interesting thing is, we're doing the pushing and pulling, and I feel like a lot of the contrib modules that I would want is if Drupal ended up being the source of data.
Yeah.
But in this case, Drupal was like a client.
Right.
So a lot of the stuff we kind of had to do a little bit more custom. We definitely did a lot of good, like of the underlying APIs,
mm-hmm.
The Drupal libraries and the Symfony libraries and things, those got used a bunch. I will say we did actually have to do some things that felt like we were working with those Drupal APIs when we did there's the front end that exists for the people from the college, right? The college employees. And I mentioned this very briefly, because they're not inside the IES firewall, they actually had it's the same Drupal site, the same login, but because of their user role would send them off to a different dashboard. And that dashboard said, these are the students that belong to my college. These are the ones who are, active. These are the ones who are active and approved. These are the ones who are pending approvals. And they could look at their contact information so that they can go look them up in their school database. And they do things like make sure that they don't have any disciplinary actions against them, or make sure that their grade point average is above a certain amount or whatever. And then they can go, yep, all these people are good. Thank you very much. So some of that did require, because we built that as a React app, some of that did require us to have Drupal APIs, like the JSON APIs and things like that.
So I think my next question, it's not completely a fair question, because I know it's not apples to apples between the Drupal 7 site to the Drupal 10 site, and there's probably some functionality differences that we weren't able to get to, but just from a amount of custom code standpoint, moving from 7 to 10, more custom code, less custom code, about the same? Any idea?
I would say, you'd probably measure it and it would be less. And a lot of it is actually in other parts of the site that are not the parts that we're talking about right now, sort of like the parts that display things about what the programs are, when does it start? When does it end? What courses are offered during that program? There's all this sort of display logic. If you visit the site and you never hit the register button, all the stuff that you see when you're not logged in, that's where a lot of the custom code existed. And a lot of the sort of like re-architecting of data and things happened was on the display side. And there was even more complexity because they, like I said at the beginning, they have a sister organization, and that sister organization actually wants to syndicate some of the information, not from the backend database, but from the Drupal site, because the marketing team, for one, is writing all this great content, uploading all these great photos and videos and information and the course descriptions. And then the sister company wants to syndicate that content, but they need to translate it into, Japanese, Korean, or Chinese, and they need to, customize it for their sort of local audience. So they would use some of it, but not all of it. And they also were not getting, 100% of the information. It was a whole other thing. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but that's where a lot of the custom code that we removed came from that. And I would say also in the things that would have to like save and validate the information, because they were originally keeping 2 copies of all the information between the backend database, the front end database. Now there's only the backend database and a light wrapper around it that we need to do the Drupal stuff, like the dashboards, for example.
So if someone was embarking on a similar project, Drupal 7 to Drupal 10, heavy backend integration, what advice could you give them? What lessons? What are the difficult lessons that you learned that you wouldn't want to see anybody else go through?
Absolutely. And I actually took some notes for myself so that I could remember what things that I would want to say, because I knew I would forget at the moment. I will say probably the number one thing was be prepared and start forming the relationship with the client and the other backend developers. In this case, they were in-house developers that were maintaining the backend. We were doing the Drupal site, and give them the expectation that we're going to come back to you and we're going to ask questions, and we're going to sometimes challenge, things that you are doing, or ask you to do a little bit of extra work because we want to challenge the complexity, right? We don't want to just accept complexity and say, well, this is how it is. Everything is just like this, and end up doing all this extra work when maybe a short conversation could have really, handled a lot of that problem. So the communication, and also, not deciding, well, we're just going to do what we do and we're going to finish it. And if it works, then it works. And if it doesn't work, it's not our fault, right? You don't want to have that pointing fingers moment when you have multiple different teams that you're working with. And these teams could be inside your organization, or like in ours, it was a vendor and a client and an internal team, right? Or sometimes it's multiple external teams. You don't want to get into that game. Like, start working on the relationship as soon as you can, and, be ready and be flexible. That's a big one. Another one that we probably learned, and I wish we had more time to do, was sort of create more internal documentation for what that external API was doing. In this case, the internal team was working on the API at the same time that we were trying to use it, because all these projects sort of got approved at the same time, and like, yes, we're going to do this. We're going to upgrade everything. And the internal API is getting rewritten while we're trying to create our first code for it.
A moving target. That sounds like fun.
Yeah. And that also meant that sometimes the API would go down because they're doing an upgrade, or it's a Java application we have to redeploy. And so it's down for a few minutes in the middle of the working day, which is when the other people that are working on it want to be working on it too. So I wish that we would have also done better things about writing stubs or test cases, things that didn't depend on the API being there, in order to do something like, hey, we submit the application. if it was in dummy application mode, submit the application and get back response, or submit the application and get back, failure, or submit the application and get back this status was wrong. In the real world, what we ended up doing was a lot more manual of like, okay, I'm going to fill out this application. I'm going to set one of the fields to something wrong. I'm going to submit it and make sure I get the right thing back against the real API, because we just didn't feel like we had time to build all those other things. But I kind of wish that it did.
Was there time available for automated tests, to write automated tests?
I did not do a lot of automated tests, but I did a lot more PHP standing than I ever did in the past on something like this. That level of like linting it and parsing through it and things really mattered a lot, when it would say like, there's a variable here that is never getting read. And then I could go to somebody while I was doing their code review and say, hey, please run this tool so that you can find the same issue that Stan just found.
What level of PHP stand were you running it at? I know all the other PHP stand nerds like me out there are wondering the same thing.
That's a great question. I want to say that I'm usually somewhere in like 5 or 6 land.
Yeah, that's the sweet spot, I think, for Drupal development. It's really tough to get past 6.
Right, yeah.
I mean, you're going to see a lot of the iterable array issues.
And like it complains about like you're not sending the right, data to this function, but
right.
It's not actually very well documented what you should be sending.
Those issues it's mainly a documentation issue. And a lot of times it actually ends up being something where the documentation is inherited from Drupal core, which means, it's not going to be fixed for a long time, if ever, because who can document, all of the various levels of a node object?
Yeah.
It's too dynamic. But anywho, any other lessons learned?
Yeah, I would also say work on the parts that you can, and focus on getting a working product. I mean, I think a lot of these things are related to that, but especially when you're working with an outside API, if you have an idea that something could change or they might add new features, if this is a long-running project, right? It took us over a year from when we first sort of signed the contract to when we deployed something and deployed another thing. I mean, some of this was happening in real time, that as things were changing, we had to be ready for that, and understanding that it was coming, again, like communicating with the other team and making sure we knew when their release windows were and when they were going to be adding new features or adding new functionality that we were relying on, meant that we could prioritize what tasks we were working on. We could say, okay, well, we can't finish this new feature with the API until the next deployment of the new API thing happens. So let's spend some more time on the dashboard, or let's spend some more time on the React application, or let's spend some more time on the other parts of the site, that are not related to this backend integration. And we'll come back to this next sprint. So slotting in time for changes, and waiting on outside forces, I think was important.
So is it all done? Is it all launched? Are you on to another project?
It is way launched, and this all launched, I think, more than a year ago at this point. So you can definitely go and use it and see it. And I actually don't work for the agency anymore that originally built this, but this is a project I put a lot of my personal time and effort and sweat and blood into. So I feel like it would be cool to talk about some of the lessons learned.
Excellent. Well, always great to talk to you. I look forward to seeing you in October, right? What are the dates?
October 11th, 12th, and 13th, Pacific Northwest Drupal Summit in Seattle.
All right, Mr. Price, we'll see you on another episode in the future, I'm sure.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the DrupalEasy podcast. Don't forget to check out all of our long-form Drupal training courses at DrupalEasy.com. And stay tuned for the next episode of the DrupalEasy podcast. See ya!